In a small village in France, a woman missionary and nurse found herself in this little village, away from resources, away from any type of support, cut off by the occupying forces, in the midst of a little village that was being bombarded and threatened. So she found herself doing what she was trained to do, being a nurse, offering care to the people who were struggling, who were suffering, who were injured, who were dealing with illness. She essentially became one of them, even though she was from someplace else, another land. Her compassion, her caring, her nursing ability made her accepted in the community. Unfortunately, she contracted a serious illness and died. No one knew where she came from. She talked about being from America, but they were unsure, and the only thing they knew to do was to celebrate her life. So they went to the local priest and asked if he would have a mass for her and if she could be buried in the church cemetery out behind the little village church. The priest said, "Oh yes, I'd be glad to have a funeral mass for her, and we can bury her. But I happen to know she wasn't Catholic, so she can't be buried inside the fence of the cemetery. But she can be buried just outside the fence." The people of her community were upset and said, "But she's one of us. She's cared for us. She's loved us. She's healed us." The priest said, "I'm so sorry. I just can't do it." So they had the service, had the burial, and she was laid to rest just outside the fence of the little cemetery behind the village church. Which presents us with a question that's in front of us in our life all the time. Who's in and who's out? Who's in and who's out? Now, my feelings about this go back to what used to be junior high school, it's now called middle school, when there was that group of people that were the in people, and then there was everybody else, and then somewhere out there was me. That's the way it felt. And I always wondered, not totally who's in and who's out, but I really began to struggle with the question, who gets to decide? And in our life, in our world, in our church, in our community, who's in, who's out, and who gets to decide? You don't have to look very far in our world today. Maybe talk to your friends and neighbors, go to work, go to school, read the newspaper, and a myriad of opinions are out there about who's in and who's out of God's way of living. And there are people all over the world ready to tell you who's in and who's out, and then there's another growing group that's willing to tell you it really doesn't matter because there is no God. So who's in and who's out, and who gets to decide? We've been looking at what I call the J-gender from the 4th chapter of the Gospel according to Luke. Jesus went back to his little hometown in Nazareth. He went to the worship service in the synagogue, as was his custom. They handed him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He found the place where it is written, "And the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor, release to the captive, recovery of sight to the blind, freedom to the oppressed, and to announce the year of God's favor." Gave the scroll back to the attendant, sat down, and began to teach them, and said, "Today, right now, these words are fulfilled in your hearing." It starts out and says everybody there was saying, oh, this is our boy, all right. Hometown boy, we like this guy. Yeah, he's bringing us God's good news. God likes us, and he's just affirming that. Woo! Did this kid grow up here? Wonder where he got all of this. You know, we've heard all sorts of good stuff about him, and here he is. He went on to say, almost as if he could sense and even hear them thinking, yeah, here he is. He's going to bring God's blessing to us, and we're going to get rid of those foreign occupiers, stinking Romans. All those people who were lording over us are going to get theirs because Jesus is here announcing God's good news. Because if anybody's poor, we people who live in Nazareth are. And if we need release from our captivity, we need it badly, and we need healing. We need to be freed from oppression. We're ready for God's time. Bring it on. And Jesus said, well, doubtless you will say, make that acceptable time of God filled in your life in this moment. Bring salvation in your presence and give it to us right now. But said Jesus, I want to tell you, a prophet is without honor in their hometown. People need to listen to God. And Jesus said, let me remind you what your holy book says. What you understand God's word speaking to you. Talks about the great prophet Elijah. Yeah, Elijah, we like that guy. Yeah. Zapped up into heaven. Ooh, Elijah. And said Jesus, there was a famine 3 years and 6 months in Israel. Now there were plenty of widow women in Israel. But God sent this great prophet Elijah to a Gentile woman. And God fed the woman, her son, and Elijah. And God's gracious, loving mercy sustained them. Not because there weren't plenty of widows in Israel, but because God went outside to a Gentile. And did Elijah's successor, Elisha? Oh man, what a prophet. There were plenty of lepers in Israel who needed healing. But who did Elisha heal? A foreigner, a Gentile. So these good people of Nazareth, good people just like you and me, these good people of Nazareth responded as all human beings do. When we find our security, our safety, our protective fences somehow battered out, they responded in that way that human beings always do. We feel threatened, so let's kill. All of a sudden, they didn't like what they were hearing anymore. We don't know if they grabbed a hold of Jesus or how they got him, but they began to hurt him out, and they pushed him up on top of a hill. On the edge of it was a cliff, and they were going to hurl him off. They were going to kill him. When we get threatened, when somebody's threatening our safety, our security, our assurances, let's kill them. Now, they eventually did, but it wasn't this time. And Luke writes, he disappeared from among them. There's no doubt about it that most of us likely don't have to look too hard to find ourselves threatened by one or a million things in our world today. And we have the same response. We want to throw up walls of protection. Sometimes I wonder, as I think about my own issues in dealing with my safety and security, I find it interesting and strange, and I'm not the only one, but I find it intriguing that as I look at everything that's going on in our world today, that I don't have any problem with Muslims. And in fact, I'm more than willing to have conversations with them, engage in dialogue, and accept them. Buddhist? I like Buddhist. Hindus? Oh, great people. Baha'i? People of all other faiths in the world? No problem. Agnostics? Atheists? Yeah, come on, let's talk. Now this is for me. I struggle with myself and our sisters and brothers within the Christian tradition. I get very, very threatened when somebody says, I'm Christian, but I know this is the way God is. And I say, are you kidding me? That's wrong. I think that's absolutely horrendous. Then I say, oh yeah, I'm open and accepting. I can talk to anybody from any faith or no faith, but man, if you're a Christian and you believe in what I think is really not the right way, I start to feel very defensive and threatened. And so I have to ask myself, who's in and who's out? And who gets to decide? Caroline Lewis, professor at Luther Seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota, wrote on her blog about 3 weeks ago about a seminary trip she was leading. Students from the seminary, and they'd had a chance to visit with some people, and on this trip they were able to sit down with two men. These two men shared with this group of students and faculty from Luther Seminary their life experience, and both of them had a similar experience. They both had daughters who were killed. They both lost a beautiful, vivacious, life-loving daughter. They met with this group and shared their hurt, their pain, their grief, faces contorted with deep, deep sadness. They talked about, both of them shared that they really, really struggled with whether or not they could continue going on and living their life with this horrid loss of a beloved child. And they said that they had that normal human response. I mean, if we feel threatened, we tend to lash out in violence, but if somebody violently takes the life of a loved one, which happened to both of these women, then our tendency is to say, let's go get those. They both said they struggled and finally made the decision that revenge was not the way, but rather the better way was to share their pain live into their grief, and be willing to engage in dialogue. Two fathers, each one lost a daughter to a violent death. One of them, an Israeli Jew, and the other, a Palestinian Muslim. And they're both a part of a group. At this point, 600 families are part of this group. Parents who've lost children and family members. And even though they're Jewish and Muslim, Israeli and Palestinian, they have made the conscious choice to come together, embrace each other, and find reconciliation rather than seeking to continue the violence and revenge. Who's in? Who's out? Who gets to decide? One of the fathers says, no wall, talking about the wall between Israel and Palestine. One of the fathers said, no wall, no matter how high, can stop two kinds of people. One determined suicide bomber, and the one determined peacemaker. In his book, Exclusion and Embrace, Miroslav Volf says, the will to give ourselves to others and welcome them, to readjust our identities to make space for them, is prior to any judgment about others, except that of identifying them in their humanity. Why, that pushes me to think about when I accept the other who is radically different than me, that means I have to readjust my identity as a human being and even as a follower of Jesus. Now, I don't want to make you think that that's comfortable, because it's not. But I think it is an invitation from God. Robert Frost wrote a famous poem. You all probably know it. It's called Mending Wall. The first line is, something there is that doesn't love a wall. Now you may know this poem, and you know, twice he quotes the neighbor who says, good fences make good neighbors. But Robert Frost spends this entire poem saying, something there is that does not love a wall. Now, whether we like it or not, if we're on the inside and we have a wall protecting us, we feel pretty good. But if you're on the outside and there's a wall, I don't like it. A few years after the war was over, finally, the family members of the woman nurse who had died in this little village of France finally tracked down what had happened to her. And they found out she'd been buried outside this little church in this little community. And so these family members decided to go to France and find her grave and simply pay their final respects. It wasn't too long after the war was over, they made their way and they went to the little village. They went to the church. They went out behind the church to the cemetery and were walking around outside the wall, and somebody had told them about where they thought the grave was, and they were walking around outside the wall, looking all over. Now, there weren't huge markers, but they'd been told there was an identifying marker so they could tell where the woman was buried. They walked around for a while, and finally, older priest came out of the church into the cemetery yard and walked over to them and said, "Can I help you?" And so they told him the story. He said, "Oh, yes. I was the priest then. I was here then. And I remember this. Yeah, I can show you where she's buried. You'll have to come around to the front of the church, though. So they went around, and he went through the church and met them and said, come on, follow me. And he took them to the church, and they went outside into the cemetery. And he walked out amongst the graves. And he said, oh, yes, here's her grave, and I'll leave you alone so you can have some quiet moments in thinking about your loved one. As he started to walk away, one of the family members said, well, hey, excuse me, Father, but we were told that you wouldn't allow her to be buried inside the fence of the cemetery. And yet, this is inside the fence. The priest said, oh, yes, very painful, very painful, very painful, yes. I did have to make that decision. It was just awful. And yes, we did bury her outside the fence. But you see, a few weeks later, I moved the fence. Who's in and who's out? Who gets to decide? Maybe we ought to be in the fence moving business. We don't have to break down the walls. We don't have to take out the fences. Let's just move the fences. Let's expand the size of our tent. Let's extend God's boundary. God's grace is for anybody and everybody. Two weeks ago, preaching on the first part of this text, where Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to proclaim good news to the poor, release to the captive, recovery of sight to the blind, freedom to the oppressed, and the year, the time of God's favor. I quoted from the latest Oxfam study of wealth in our world. In that Oxfam study, I noted that the study in 2015 found that there are 62 people who control most of the world's wealth. In fact, the top 62 people in our world have as much wealth as the bottom 3.6 billion people. Now, if we're going to think about moving the fence, how do we respond to that statistic? Well, part of it could be, well, let's respond and say, well, I hope I'm a little closer to the 62. Let me do all I can to at least get some of their crumbs. I like that part better than the other year. Or some of us might say, oh, I really can identify with this 3.6 billion better. Let's get ourselves organized and let's go get them. Well, what if we move the fence? What if we move the fence and recognize the reality that absolutely every one of us have one foot firmly planted on both sides of that division? Now, I don't think any of us here are one of those 62, but boy, in comparison to that bottom 3.6 billion, we're very well off. But on the other hand, we can identify with the fear that we might be slipping closer and closer to that group. But what if we recognize we're in both camps? And so what we can do is be in dialogue of both sides and understand that our call is to be people who include and embrace everyone, no matter who they are or where they are. Now, I don't know which side is going to challenge you more, to talk to this top 62 group? Or are the folks, 3.6 billion of them, on the bottom? But I think we got to talk to both sides. And it seems to me like I saw somewhere, I'm trying to remember where I saw it, but somewhere I saw that the mission of the Rose Hill United Methodist Church is to build Christ-centered, transforming relationships through invitation, healing, and service.